Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much all for coming out to join us for this in conversation with Sir Richard Eyre, a man who needs no introduction to anyone interested in theatre. Obviously, one of our foremost directors in TV and film and theatre, but also, perhaps more pertinently, former artistic director of the National Theatre and indeed Nottingham Playhouse. And Richard's regime at the National and the way he has written about it in his diaries and his books was hugely influential on me. Really sort of, I think, established so many of the principles that run through British theatre now. And so I thought it would be a wonderful thing, given that he was working with us here in the Scandinavia that is Richard Eyre here at the Almeida, if we could grab a moment and talk a little bit about this thing about being an artistic director and how you program theatres and how repertoire gets chosen and the kinds of people one works with. So I thought I'd begin by saying that personally, I'm on my third artistic directorship here at the Almeida, and for me, I remember I used to go around rep theatre when I was in my 20s, and I'd say to directors, "Oh, you know, I'd love to direct Milton's Paradise Lost," and they go, "Great, here's Rookery Nook." Or I'd go with some major Shakespeare tetralogy and come out with The Acheborn. And I got so, I guess, frustrated with not being able to make the shows that I had in my head that I felt the only way I could possibly do that was to try and run a company or a theatre. And so I just wondered, when did you know you wanted to be an artistic director? And is that
well, I didn't know. I wasn't, as you were, emerged from the womb, a theatre director. I didn't know I was an actor.
Untimely ripped.
I was an actor, and I didn't know I had directed a film when I was at university, but I'd not directed any theatre. I became an actor because I'd acquired an agent when I was at university, and so was made to believe, given the confidence, to say I was a professional actor. And I got a few jobs. And then I realized that that was a fraud, and that it became increasingly embarrassing for me and for the audience, I think. And I was in a show, it was a musical, Christmas musical, and I got together some of the cast of the play to do a Sunday night production. And it was a play called The Knack by Angelico. And it was the director of the theatre said to me after this Sunday night production, he said, "You have a decision to make, whether you want to be a director or an actor." And I said, "Oh, obviously, a director, yeah," because I knew I wasn't a good enough actor. And then, astonishingly, and I think the lesson for me was that everybody in their life, the luck, people talk a lot about luck. I mean, we talk endlessly about luck as if rehearsals and forethought weren't enough. But the luck for me was that the man running the theatre took me on as an assistant. I got an Arts Council bursary and then became his associate in Leicester and then in Edinburgh. And his remit to me was, just, what do you want to direct? And so it was most of the 20th century classics and Shakespeare. And then I was sought out to run, so I became the director of productions in Edinburgh. I was sought out by a man called Stuart Burge, who later ran the Royal Court, who was running Nottingham Playhouse. And he said, "I think you should succeed me at Nottingham." So I thought, oh, well, that's my destiny. And that's how I became an artistic director. And so it wasn't quite, because I'd had this extraordinarily privileged apprenticeship and been given all these astonishing plays to direct, I wasn't in the position of being frustrated as a freelance because I couldn't direct any of the shows I wanted to.
So, and how did you find it, the move to being the person in charge, both at Nottingham and
well,
National?
it's a shock, isn't it? don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, I always find that you think it's all about giving opportunities to people, and in fact, you're endlessly disappointing people, and they get angry with you. No one's grateful for what you give them, and everyone's furious for what you don't. But I mean,
yes, that's familiar. That is familiar. But I decided at Nottingham, which was a 750-seat theatre, but must be about the same size as Northampton, isn't it?
A little bit bigger, but yeah.
And we had a company, we had a permanent company, and we did repertoire. We did 3 plays in repertoire. I mean, it seems like, it is a vanished world. And there were about 100 people who worked in the whole theatre. It was just, we were very young, and we did work from 8 o'clock in the morning, and every single night we were partying. And in my company at the time were Jonathan Pryce and Alison Steadman and Tony Sher and Tom Wilkinson and Stephen Ray. And the fun of it, it was just wonderful. And the actors used to, I don't know how they did it, but we worked 3 weekly. We rehearsed 3 weeks. And the actors would work from 10 till 5 and then do a show and matinees on Wednesdays and Saturday. And the plays, I just simply can't imagine how we did it. But I know when I thought, how do I run this theatre, I had recruited a company and developed with the company a pay scheme for the actors so that there was some kind of parity, and people who had dependents got more money than, and it was slightly age-related. And I just remember thinking, there is a maximum size for the number of people you could actually, in an organisation, that you can stay in touch with. And I've always thought that it's the same when you do a production, that it's no coincidence that there were 12 disciples. No. Because when you have a cast of more than 12, it becomes exponentially more difficult to keep the whole thing together. And I used to think that Nottingham was like a sort of nuclear reactor, and if you fed in too many rods, then it would go critical. And so you had to sort of husband resources and the whole time, and then the National is a different thing altogether.
When I was at Headlong, I had, I guess, a similar small staff, same sort of energy, and it strikes me that, do you think some of that energy came from all that extraordinary new writing you were doing at Nottingham as well? Because you have like an incredible range of writers.
We had, the now venerable Sir David Hare, Trevor Griffiths and Howard Brenton and Adrian Mitchell, and Ken Campbell, yes. But what I do remember the fun of it and the sort of irreverence of it, and we were preposterously arrogant.
A prerequisite, I think.
But you sort of put yourself on. You made your mark at
I guess we
Northampton,
were
didn't you?
Aggressive, yeah. I think what I always felt in Northampton was, in London we forget how spoilt we are about audiences coming and critics coming, and I just remember thinking, we have to make as much noise as possible for the city in as vulgar and crass a way as possible, and that was my style was born there. So when you got to the National, did that seem less fun? I mean, you were there taking over from legendary Peter Hall. I mean, in an organisation that was in some financial trickiness.
It was tricky. I mean, one of the National, the new National, had moved out of the old Vic into the building on the South Bank, and for some reason, my axiom of theatre is a theatre is a theatre is a theatre, that however big, it's still a theatre, it's still a pyramid structure, and theatres have been the same for 1,000 years, and they will remain the same, and you go backstage any theatre in the world and you feel at home. So for some reason, the National the strategy was to departmentalize it, so that it had a sort of, instead of having a vertical management structure, it had a horizontal management structure. So you had a production department, costume department, wig department, sound department, and they were all allocated their separate autonomous budgets. And I said fairly soon after I'd arrived, and I suppose I should have known this before, I said, well, can I see a budget for the plays that I just told you we're going to do? And they said, we don't do budgets. We don't. I said, it's a theatre, of course you do. You have a pro forma budget. And they said, we don't have pro forma budgets because we allocate resources to the production department, so on, lighting department. They divide it up. I said, but this is insane. I mean, for instance, if the music department would say, if it's an Olivier production, you can have 7 musicians, or 5 in the Littleton, 3 in the Cotswold. And I said, but supposing the play doesn't justify having any music at all, what do you do? Anyway, this was more or less the worst
like Broadway
argument I had at the National. And curiously, somebody was asking me about this the other day. Curiously, I virtually didn't write about this at all in my diaries. I think because it was so miserable having these arguments, which were to do with structure and to do with management, and not to do with the stuff.
And was there an organisational culture as well? I mean, was it?
Yeah. Yes, which stemmed from these baronies.
Right. Yeah.
As it would. So it wasn't like a theatre.
Yeah.
And so I kept saying, we have to remember Gertrude Stein. We have to remember a theatre is a theatre is a theatre. And that was a sort of relentless axiom of mine, along with our purpose we have to remember is to make the whole greater than the sum of the parts.
And did you have a sense of what you were going to do when you started there? Did you, I mean, one looks back at, the discovery of companies, people like Cheap by Jowl, Complicité, the international work you brought in, the big ensembles. But at the time when you started, did you know where you were heading?
I knew that I wanted to enfranchise a whole generation of directors and actors and designers who were partly my generation, but actually mostly a generation younger than me. People like Declan, Nick Heitner.
I sometimes find that, because I guess I've been similar-ish, and I find I spend most of my time with people between 6 and 12 years younger than me, and I wonder, is that narcissistic in some way? It's sort of
well, it makes you feel good.
Yeah, it's sort of like being the sixth former with the entry form in a way. I was saying that to Katie Mitchell the other day. Do you think? I always think directors are split between those who want reverence from the acolytes or from the grandees, and would you rather that Peter Stein said your work was wonderful, or Robert Icke? Did you have do you think there's anything in that, the generational?
Well, I always loved about the theatre, and I do love. I love the fact that the people I'm working with now, who will appear on stage later, are, well, I could be their father. Actually, I could be their grandfather. And I love it. I love the egalitarian nature of theatre. When I first became an actor, what I loved was the fact that it didn't seem to matter what gender you were, what age you were, or what your sexual orientation was. It just, you had to contribute. And it's just a wonderful parity, and that's, I think, I've always found that, and I love that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I always think that, that's then the amazing thing, that the young girl in the room could be playing Juliet, or she could be the serving girl, and that the status is nothing to do with the age, and yet, strangely, I guess a lot of us, I think somebody said, theatre is one of the few art forms that is always trying to please its parents. What you wouldn't say about fine art or contemporary music necessarily, and I find that tension fascinating in theatre, the sense of generational delivery to an audience, and yet an absence of generational identity in the room. I think it's the sort of mischief of it, I think.
I like the lack of sentimentality too.
Yeah.
We're always scorned, people say, oh, people in theatre, you're so soppy. I think we're incredibly hard-headed and unsentimental. We don't go, oh, Rupert. When I was, there's a thing David Hare told me, it's an army expression, the when-we's. Do you know about the when-we's? Well, the when-we's are in the army, when you go, when we were in Aden, when we were, and when-we's exist in every profession. I mean, politics is,
There's a bit of that in theatre as well.
There's a bit of it, but not much because it's all gone. I did a film early with Tony Hopkins and Ian McKellen, which was the dresser. And we had 2 weeks rehearsal. About half of that was stories about the theatre, but it wasn't how glorious it was. On the whole, it was, God, would you believe what a nightmare it was?
Yeah, true. And so when you were at the National particularly, did you feel you learnt more, particularly in programming terms, from your flops or your successes?
When I took over, the board of the National had undertaken a review of the staffing of the National, and they had got a guy who actually was Jack Straw's brother, called Ed, who's a brilliant management consultant. He had talked to about 500 people in the National Theatre, so he had a map of the National Theatre which was more detailed and comprehensive than anybody else. And I used to talk to him a lot. He was like my father confessor. And I said to him one day, doesn't it scare you, it certainly does me, that here I am with no management experience, managing this enormous organization with huge budget? He said, not at all, because you have the experience and training that every chief executive envies, and that's directing. Yeah. So directing is, because you're managing, you're forming a little society, and you weld together a society, you have common aims, strategies, and when if you're lucky.
I think, because I was saying to a young director the other day that the more different kinds of methodologies and processes I see in different directors and different ways of working, the more I'm convinced that the only real sign of a director is, can you lead the room? Can you be in a room and have people listen to you with authority about the material, even in your doubt? And but I think translating that to being an artistic director is not always easy, because there's so many different things.
Exactly, but I think if once I sort of got the confidence that actually I did know about managing people, and I wasn't ashamed to use the word management, I then started to feel confident. It took me about 2 years, I would say at least 2 years, and then I felt sure-footed.
And what was the biggest programming catastrophe in your time there? What was your
well?
That moment when you look and you see something dead on stage. It's just
well, I think the most conspicuous was a show that I did. It was perfectly obvious that we had to have a big comedy in the Olivier. And the Olivier, you recognize, is the financial powerhouse of the National. And it used to be frightening when you look at the box office figures and see hemorrhaging 100,000 a week. So I decided we had to have a big popular comedy. And so we thought about doing Front Page, great play. And then I said, but Front Page is so well known as a great success of the National Theatre at the Old Vic. Shouldn't we do something different? And the then literary manager said, there is this play by Charles MacArthur, who was one half of Front Page. And he said, we should have a reading of it. It's very funny. We had this reading, and sure enough, it was very funny in the reading. And then I put it on in the Olivier. It was massive flop. It was called Johnny on the Spot. Massive flop. I mean, it was just, you could see the fog coming in during the opening night, and you could see the sort of relish because we'd had a good time, and you thought, now they've found something to justifiably. it was awful, and of course, if you run a theatre,
I know. I was gonna say.
you're
You have
so
to go in the next
exposed.
day.
You have
I know.
to you go in the next day, and you sort of have to play a captain's innings,
Yeah.
don't you? So your shows.
I mean, it's the shame, isn't it? I think carrying the shame around, but also, I mean, did you feel from something like that you could usefully learn stuff from moving forward?
I'm not sure you learn because it's always different.
So traumatic.
You learn. Oh yeah, don't have a disaster. I think the big thing I learnt at the National, in a sense I didn't at Nottingham because it was too small, and I used to do the majority of shows, or at least we did maybe 12 a year and I'd do 6. Mm-hmm. But at the National, I'd do maybe 3 shows, and there were 15, 16, 17 shows a year. The thing I learnt was whatever the opposite of Schadenfreude, the taking joy in other people's successes, so that actually to go with a project, if somebody had come to me and said, I mean, as Stephen Daldry came and said, I want to do a production of An Inspector Calls. I said, Stephen, are you sure? This, because I'd seen a production of An Inspector Calls, the traditional version. And I said, this is punishing, isn't it, Steve? And he said, no, because this is how it should be. Yeah. And he acted it out in my office. And I thought, okay, I'll go with that. Yeah. That sounds great. Miniature house and so on.
So how did you, I mean, that thing of listening to and getting the best out of artists, some writers, directors, actors, some of whom are very eccentric and capricious and difficult. What do you think whether you're patriarch or matriarch in the organisation, what do you think is the key to getting all that to work, to sort of getting people to the table? And
I think you've got to listen and be patient. I mean, Declan Donnellan used to say, "You're my dad," and he'd come in every day after rehearsals, and I would think, I don't think I'm your dad. I think I'm your psychiatrist. But I think, and I can testify that you've been very helpful to me on this, just by not saying what you should do is, but maybe this and maybe that, and just nudging. Because the great gift is when you ask somebody to, you act as host, ask me to do this play. Yeah. Which is a far from obvious play to program
at Christmas.
But so you make that move, and then I think you do what you do, which is lend support and help, and aren't in competition.
And how did you feel again at the National about that balance between listening to the artist, listening to Stephen acting out his priestly, the sort of strange, maybe very idiosyncratic personal response, with the need to be relevant, like you had, with the Hair trilogy, and one of the things that I think that Nick Klein did very successfully as well, was sort of make it feel about contemporary Britain. Do you think those things are in tension, the sort of the mystery of the artist versus the sort of relevancy of the organisation?
Yeah, I think so. I think you have to. I mean, I was always interested in the politics of theatre, because I think every piece of work has its own politics. I mean, even if you go and see the conventional West End comedy, and the makers disavow any politics, that's a political position. And so I like work that has attitude. I don't like polemic, but I do like people saying, well, this play, this 19th century Russian play tells us something because we see ourselves reflected in it. And I think that theatre is uniquely good at presenting a sort of social group. It's wonderful at distilling a social group and making, I mean, Ibsen, you get this world, and somehow it's about 3 or 4 people who are very idiosyncratic, but somehow it resonates as about a whole society.
Yeah. What about I think one of the greatest privileges of being an artistic director is that you get to be in those late rehearsal room run-throughs of other people's work. You don't have to deal with any of the sweat and blood and tears and horrors that they've had to put it on, but it has that incredible immediate fragility of being, and it's almost performed for you in a way, because you're there to adjudicate. And I had it with the Oris Star we did it here earlier the year, just sort of, it was so effortlessly achieved, and you marvel at how much sweat and difficulty there is in one's own work or in other people's work. And for you as an AD, maybe at the National or Nottingham, which show stands out for you as you sat down and saw poetry and just was a privilege to be there?
Actually, it was when I first went to Nottingham, I did a play. I commissioned David Hare and Howard Brenton to write a play about corruption in local politics, which was current at the time, the Poulsen affair in Newcastle. And they wrote a play called Brass Neck, and it was sort of gloriously scandalous, and my board were very, very upset about it because it had, the second scene was a Masonic induction scene, and none of them on the board would say why they were so offended by it. But many years later, I had a company with David at the National, and I did the government inspector with Jim Broadbent and Rick Mail, and David wrote, with Howard, wrote Pravda. And he said, come in and see a run-through. And I saw what I think is the single most remarkable performance I've ever seen, was Tony Hopkins taking off as, what's his name?
Lambert LaRue.
Who was the sort of the Rupert Murdoch, the South African Rupert Murdoch. And I just remember him standing at this angle forward, and his hair brushed back, and he looked as if he was in a wind tunnel. And in a rehearsal room, it was absolutely titanic. But
do you think he'll come back to the stage, having just worked with
Tony?
him?
No, doing the dresser was his way of saying how much I love the theatre, as long as I don't have to appear in it. But, what's the best performance you've seen in a rehearsal room?
Gosh. I think I did a production of No Man's Land a while ago with Michael Gambon, who was in a similar, I think he said publicly now, hasn't he, that he's retired from the stage because he finds learning the lines hard, and it was, the entire rehearsal process was making Mike feel comfortable about his ability to do the text, and very complicated, strange, Pintery part Hurst. I think it was done here actually a few years ago, and Mike would always be apologising and mucking around, but actually more than anything apologising, because David Bradley was playing Spoon, and he adored David. And then erratically, maybe three rehearsals, we were rehearsing in Ireland, he would just explode, and he had a sort of, I remember saying to him, like, how what is it about Pinter that is so fantastic? And Mike, who would never, you've worked with him, you'd never talk about the craft. But he said, some plays you do, and it's like you step out from the wings, and it's like you're on an ice rink, and you've got to go very quickly and very lightly across it, or else you'll slip over. He said, when I do Harold's work, I put my foot down, and I feel like roots going down through the substage, down into the foundations of the theatre. And sometimes he really blew up, and sort of, there's that great bit, isn't it, in The Year of the King, I think, where Tony Sher and Pete Bostlethwaite write about watching Mike do Lear in rehearsal, and saying it was like sort of acting next to a sort of cinema. Because he had that sort of size. But it's sort of, I think in those moments you just become groupies, don't you? You go back to, in fact, actually the Hollow Crown, actually the Richard II I did for the Hollow Crown that you did Henry IV for. We did a rehearsal with Ben Whishaw and Rory Kinnear of the deposition scene. And that was extraordinary because Ben had played Hamlet, Rory had played Laertes at the Old Vic, Rory had just stopped playing Hamlet. There was a slight, not competition, but a healthy understanding of each other. And I said, well, shall we read the play? Should we read the scene? Yes, fine. And they sort of looked at each other as near as we are. And I think Rory began, and he was off book. And so was Ben. And they looked down at their text, and they went through the whole scene. And I would have paid millions and millions of pounds to have been there. It was sort of a very special moment. And but it sort of humbles you about really the sort of that all we do is watch really and celebrate. You know, at a root, we're not really much more important than that. Do you think there's a time? I got struck when I was in New York recently about the non-for-profit theatres there. Once you're in position, you're there for life, basically.
I think it's shocking.
And it's sort of
Isn't it
deadly.
shocking?
But how do you know when to go?
Well, I think 10 years is, you know, that's a generation, isn't it? You should let somebody else have a go.
Were you happy to go? I mean,
I was happy when I said I'm going to go. Then people said, "Oh, you're going," and then I thought, "Oh no, I shouldn't have come." But I was sort of, I was broken-hearted when I left. But and it probably took me a year for my heart to mend.
Did you miss it at all?
I do miss it. I do miss it when I go there, and there are fewer and fewer people who were there when I was there. But 10 years is good.
Right.
Rupert, you've got
while,
years in it. But this is such a great theatre, I think, to run.
We're privileged.
You've made such a dazzling start.
8 more to go.
I just wondered, when you're running a company or a building that has a long-term outlook, how you draw the balance between themes that you want to carry forward and individual productions that have something of interest, how you get that balance?
Well, I'm wary of themed seasons, actually. But having said that, the Greeks doing those plays, you see, I
remember when I mentioned it to you ages ago, and you looked at me really. I said, "I'm thinking about doing it maybe a whole year, all of them."
Yeah.
And you looked, there was a long pause. You said, "I think that's a great idea." And I remember thinking,
I felt like the Nigel Hawthorne character. Well, Prime Minister, that's very brave. But it's, I would say, thoroughly vindicated. It's sort of, it happens a lot in the music world. They say, you know, romantic composers of the mid-19th century, and that has no purchase on the public's imagination at all. But if you say, you know, Shakespeare's Roman plays, or the history plays, or, you know, the Greek tragedies, I think that's got real allure.
Yeah.
And they sort of resonate against each other.
Do you think? How do you think the ecology, particularly in London, has changed since you left the National? I mean, in what way is theatre different? I mean, I agree the backstage is still a backstage, and maybe it doesn't change ever. But do you look around and say this is a different landscape to when I was?
I don't
at the National?
really, you know, except that when I was running the National, which was in the dog days of Thatcher and then John Major's time, and there wasn't much. Well, there isn't any now, support for, from government, and we had an ever-diminishing government subsidy. And newspapers were forever announcing the death of theatre. But then they were also announcing the death of the novel, and the death of pop music, and the death of film, and, you know, never the death of journalism. But so I would say that it's incredibly robust. I mean, the audiences throughout London, audiences here, audiences in the West End, audiences at the National Theatre, they've remained fantastically consistent. And I mean, there is I always think the odd thing, the idiosyncratic thing about theatre, which is why I think when people say, "Oh, live on TV," it's actually the fact that you have a living human being and a living audience, and you can't make that abstract. There is no such thing as modernist theatre, you know, because there's always this vulnerable human being who is sort of more or less the same size and, you know, and human, and that's the draw, isn't it?
How do you? I mean, because I agree that's true of London, but do you ever, I sometimes feel like one of those people holding on to the helicopter in Saigon. That I look around at regional theatre, which the audiences are not, and the funding is just
But
really.
some of them are great.
Yeah,
Bristol's got very good audience.
Yeah.
Liverpool,
Yeah.
Gemma Bodnett's in Liverpool. I don't know about
Manchester
Northampton.
Doing well.
Manchester is doing well.
Yeah.
So,
but I mean, I guess you and I both started out in regional theatre and spent quite a lot of time in regional theatre. I mean, that doesn't seem to be a route that directors and actors are so keen on anymore.
I don't know. I think that's a shame, because I think we served apprenticeships. And nowadays, the thing that has changed is there's a massive proliferation of agents and of people grabbing talent. We're all guilty of it, but of sucking up talent from drama schools, from schools, and anyone with looks half interesting, they're grabbed. And whereas in my time, you would have actors like Jonathan Pryce and Tony Sher and Tom Wilkinson, who were content to spend a year or two working in regional theatre. Now, they just won't, and they're on TV, they're in a series, and everybody is a sort of talent scout.
Well, I think that's true of directors and writers, that
you think it is as true?
Well, I think it's good to get, I felt I tried to get a lot of my mistakes done privately, sort of. And so, I mean, I feel I see a lot of playwrights and emerging directors being overexposed too early, and you think, if you just done the panto and a few youth theatre shows and regional theatre, you might have not made that mistake. But one question here.
You are working with hugely talented actors. Aren't you frustrated when you work with opera singers?
Actually, the question, am I frustrated by working with opera singers? The last year I did 2 productions at the Met. One of them was Marriage of Figaro, with a cast that were all wanted to act. All of them spoke, and it's actually more or less the first time I've had, for an opera production, the whole cast from the first day of rehearsal for 5 weeks. And none of them had concerts in Puerto Rico. None of them were double booked. And they were like a theatre company. And they were pretty young. I mean, young opera standards. And incredibly alive. And it was like working on a play. And I would work on text. And I would say, we're not going to sing it. We'll just talk through the text, and we would do what you do with a cast of actors. You sit round a table and you just hammer away at the text, saying, what does it mean? And this, if you're working with an Italian libretto and you've got singers from all over the world, so what it means is really important. And what's more, we had a great conductor, James Levine, who never, ever gave a note to the singers that wasn't to do with intention. And it was a blessed time. So I have had brilliant experiences. I mean, I did a production of Carmen at the Met with Elena Garantia, who is not only staggeringly beautiful, she's a wonderful mezzo. And she said to me on the first, because I started talking about how I worked, what I could bring to opera, which is essentially, what Rupert and I do is work with actors on how to bring it to life. And she said, yes, that's what I want, because I can't sing until I know what I'm thinking. And then she said, I always wanted to be an actor, but I was turned down for the drama school in Vilnius. Not Vilnius, Riga. And so I've had really, really good experiences working with...
They are different though, aren't they?
They are different. I mean, they are different.
I always think that with actors, there's no empirical way you can say Judi Dench is better than your next door neighbour. You just and it's why actors always have terrible insecurities and needs for, should I pick the bottle up here? Or put it? Whereas with singers, they know if they can sing the note.
No,
it's like a 100-meter runner. You know if you're, and so they don't have those doubts. They don't have, and they say, fine, what do you want me to do? And it's that weird thing I find in the first run through of a play, any play, whatever the company are like. There's an incredible generosity in the room of the other actors watching their colleagues have their first. Whereas in an opera, you see the chorus sit there and go on then.
Yeah,
you know, and they're very giving if they get there, but if they don't, it's ruthless.
No, it's unforgiving. But it's the same with, you were talking earlier about how you've got to lead a room. I've seen a lot of conductors. Because of the last 6 years, I've done 5 shows at the Met. I've seen, and they've been revived, so I've seen a lot of new conductors come into the Met. The Met Orchestra is a fabulous orchestra. James Levine's orchestra, he made it over 20, 25 years. You see new conductors come in, and the orchestra have decided if they're any good before they've even got on the podium. And if their downbeat is remotely uncertain, they can't conduct. And I said, when I first worked there, I said to I met a member of the chorus on the opening night, and I said, I've really enjoyed working with the chorus, which I had, because they were great. And she said, we've enjoyed working with you because you knew what you wanted of us. She said, we normally give directors about 2 minutes.
I remember that. Listen, I could talk for ages to Richard, but I think also on behalf of the Almeida, we should thank him for these 3 incredible Ibsens that he's given this theatre. Definitive productions, Hedda Gabler, Ghosts, and Now Little Elf. I hope those of you who haven't seen it, will come and see it and enjoy it as much as we're enjoying having it here. And thank you so much, Richard, for sharing. Thank you.
Thank you.